D.C. Council Chairman Phil Mendelson said Monday he would withdraw the city's controversial crime bill after it became clear the legislation would not earn Senate approval. D.C. legislators and Hill Democrats were blindsided last week when President Biden said he would not sign the bill, which earned headlines for lowering the maximum sentence for carjacking to a mere 24 years. Despite critics that say the new code is soft on crime, if passed, it would actually increase sentences for attempted murder, attempted sexual assault, and misdemeanor sexual abuse.
Biden ally Pete Aguilar told the Hill, quote, "It's disappointing for me and anybody who believes in home rule. Honestly, I'm a former mayor of a city of 70,000, and I wouldn't want the federal government coming in and telling me what city ordinances to pass. So I think it's disappointing in that context." Joining us now to weigh in is Rafael Mangual, Nick O'Neill Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of Criminal Injustice. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, so look, I am someone who is concerned about rising crime in American cities, some American cities, including D.C. So I was prepared to, I think, agree with the reason this was not going to happen. But it sounds to me, so correct me if I'm wrong or give us your perspective on this, the carjacking concern, it looks like the penalties are still going to, while being reduced, are still extraordinarily steep and actually beyond, outside the bounds of what anyone would reasonably be charged with anyway. So, how would you respond to, I guess, the criticism then that this actually isn't undermining public safety? Do you think it is undermining public safety?
Yeah, I certainly think it's undermining public safety, but it's not just because of the carjacking provision. And one question to ask is if in fact it's true that the current sentencing practices for carjacking are already under the newly proposed maximum range, then that also raises the question of why bother to do this at all. Certainly it's not necessary if, in fact, current practices are ready to sentence well below that range. But it's not just carjacking, but also robbery, burglary, and other offenses where we saw the lower maximum penalty, the maximum penalties get lowered. And on top of that, we also saw the elimination of mandatory minimums, which is, an important aspect of sentencing insofar as one of the problems that mandatory minimum sentences respond to is the unwillingness or unreliability of judges to sentence appropriately. And so this offers some protection in that realm. Getting rid of mandatory minimums, virtually all of them, at the same time as lowering the maximum penalties while also imposing a bunch of different new burdens on the criminal justice system, for example, expanding the right to a jury trial to all misdemeanor cases, I think would have been collectively an effort that certainly undermined public safety. And that's why I think we saw such robust opposition to the bill.
But from a purely principled standpoint, I guess, why shouldn't minors be entitled to hearings under a fair system of due process?
I don't think anyone is opposed to a fair system of due process, and I don't think that the current code denies that. This has been one of the claims that I think, supporters of these kinds of reforms have made, but I don't think they've really borne their burden of proof with respect to bearing it out.
So you raised the question of why these revisions are happening, and advocates who are in support of the revisions point out that they haven't basically been revised since they were first established, however many dozens of decades ago, 100 years ago, or what have you. And you question, Robbie's presumption or statement that the 24-year penalty for carjacking might actually be out of step with other states. I just did a quick Google. In the state of Texas, I intentionally chose more conservative states. The state of Texas, it's a second-degree felony punishable by 2 to 20 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. In Florida, it's a little higher at 30 years. D.C. at 24 years doesn't seem to be widely out of step with that. Moreover, people have argued that it's important to reduce criminal penalties. For example, it was illegal to drink in the back of a party bus. Advocates said, obviously, the whole point of party buses is for people in the back to be drinking. Why make that against the law, especially if it's not being enforced for obvious reasons? That seems like a reasonable change. Another change was that sex abuse, a pretty serious crime, was only treated as a misdemeanor. And criminal justice, public defenders and the like have pointed out that they have some clients who have done very much worse things but have a lower penalty than other clients precisely because the standards were too low. All that being said, what is the objection here fundamentally from you to revising a code so that it seems to be more in line with contemporary understanding of people who need to be punished, like sexual abusers, and limiting punishment for people who don't need to be punished, like folks who pay for the service of being passengers in a party bus?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's important, to understand that the objection is not that the entirety of the proposal is bad, right? And again, there's a lot of focus on the carjacking element. I suppose that's because carjacking has been on the rise in Washington, D.C., but that's not the only crime for which maximum penalties were lowered. And I think the other thing that was objected to was the virtual elimination of mandatory minimums. All of that, I think, sends the wrong message at a time of rising crime, which is, that we're going to essentially make the system softer. And if, in fact, again, we're right about, current sentencing practices already being aligned with what the proposal was doing, I think it raises a very, logical question for a lot of people, which is then why bother to go through all of the trouble and waste all of the political capital in order to do this if, in fact, it's not necessary. But I'm all for addressing the significant overcriminalization problem, right? I mean, when I first started working in public policy, the work that I did was on the issue of statutory and regulatory overcriminalization. I think if you look at state criminal codes around the country, as I did, and I have over the years, what you'll find are a lot of crimes that really shouldn't be on the books. I mean, at the federal level alone, there's some 300,000 to 400,000 criminally enforceable rules and regulations. I can barely think of 300 things that you should go to jail for, let alone 300,000. So there are perfectly good reasons to align our criminal codes with what our contemporary understanding of criminal conduct actually is. But I do think that people saw this as kind of, a Trojan horse effort to get into the bill some other things that were misguided and that would undermine public safety. And at a time in which, the reform movement has essentially been unidirectional insofar as criminal justice reforms over the last decade have essentially lowered the transaction cost of committing crime or raised the transaction cost of enforcing the law.
That's fundamentally not true, as evidenced by the fact that the case we're talking about right now is a Democratic president of the United States of America intervening in a not state but local law change that was democratically decided upon by council members to go in a tough on crime direction, to undermine it. And that is the Democratic leader that was elected in the middle of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, riots, and who has not, in fact, passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. But I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
He's not proposing new policy, right? I mean, he's blocking a new policy.
He's vetoing reforms, democratically supported reforms.
Right, but the reforms that have gone through have been unidirectional, which is what I'm saying, right? I mean, if you look at all of the indicators that criminal justice reformers say they care about, they've been moving in the direction that they want to move in for well over a decade. The prison population over the last decade is down some 24 to 25%. Same with the jail population. Arrests are down about the same. We see a decrease in the number of police officers working in urban jurisdictions. We've seen lots of successful bail, discovery, sentencing reform efforts, decriminalization efforts. So I do think it's completely fair and apt to characterize the criminal justice reform movement as of late as unidirectional in favor of people who might find themselves ensnared in the system.
Yeah. So when I started to educate myself about this bill and what was happening with it, I was very prepared to actually agree, with some reservations about the federal government overriding local authorities, which I don't like. I was prepared to agree with the criticism, but then when it looked like, it does not seem to me that, for instance, again, the carjackings, what the sentences are on paper doesn't seem to be the issue. Maybe we need more enforcement of them and not enough people are being arrested. I don't know, but it doesn't seem like the changes to the sentencing guidelines are themselves a problem. So then why, given that we've already done this, they did the work of revising this very outdated code. So, you might say, well, not all of it is perfect, but like the work is done now. And so is it really a good idea for Biden to kind of come in dramatically and then undo all that work if we're agreeing that really like putting the on paper sentencing for this and other crimes in line with other conservative states is not actually the problem, then it seems wild to like support Biden doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that argument, might be able to be made with respect to the carjacking offenses, but not with respect to robbery, not with respect to burglary, not with respect to the other offenses for which we've seen either a lowering of the statutory maximum sentences or an elimination of the mandatory minimums. At a time in which, as Robert Conti just said on the news just the other day, the typical person charged with a homicide in Washington, D.C. has 11 prior arrests. We see the same thing in cities across the country. In Chicago, that number is 12 prior arrests, where 1 in 5 have more than 20 prior arrests. I think what this opposition reflects is a concern about the system's either inability or unwillingness to draw a line as to repeated criminal offending. And if you're going to successfully draw a line with respect to repeated criminal offending, you're going to need the tools to do that. Eliminating mandatory minimums and lowering statutory maximums for crimes beyond just carjacking, it does not signal a movement in that direction. And so, I think this is, again, a perfectly defensible response to a reform effort during a period in rising crime.
You talk a lot about mandatory minimums. Doesn't from a due process standpoint, shouldn't judges have the authority to take varying factors into account to sentence appropriately judges and juries to the facts of the cases before them, rather than having to rely on not even guidance, but official dictates from legislatures and other bodies?
I mean, it's not at all incongruous with the concept of due process for the legislature to draw boundaries with respect to a judge's discretion. I mean, we see that with statutory maximums, right?
It literally undermines a judge's discretion. It literally definitionally puts constraints on a judge's discretion.
Well, so does the statutory maximum. You're telling the judge that you don't have the discretion to sentence beyond 24 years for carjacking. That's a limit on judicial discretion.
From a due
it's
process
just a limit
perspective,
that certain people like.
From a due process perspective, many people feel like there's a much more risk in saying you have to punish someone at least this amount. And they are happy that we live in a country that establishes certain maximums for people being thrown in jail, given that the liberty interests are clearly cutting in one direction and not the other. And that some people have an investment primarily in supporting rules, rights, and obligations that support freedom, as opposed to ones that can be weaponized in order to fuel a mass incarceration crisis, as you pointed out, the prison population going up year after year. Despite, I should point out that robberies, you were pointing to the robbery statistic in particular. I don't know if you know what the old versus the new robbery guidelines are for DC, but it's worth noting that robberies are down 16% compared with the same time last year in the district.
I'd be interested to see what they are, compared to, say, 2015 or 2017 or 2019. But again, due process is not implicated by drawing out sentencing ranges or setting mandatory minimums, right? What due process refers to is the process that someone is offered when they're charged with a criminal offense. That is not undermined. I mean, if you're concerned about the appropriateness of the sentence, your mechanism here is the Eighth Amendment and cruel and unusual punishment. Now, if you think that these kinds of statutory sentence ranges are cruel and unusual, then that's an argument that can be made, but it's not a due process issue.
Rafael, do you know you stepped away from the conversation about the carjackings, which again, 24-year penalty for carjacking, and said, well, what about the new robbery rules? I wasn't able to find them right now. Do you know what the old robbery guidelines were versus the new robbery guidelines that you find to be so objectionable?
Not off the top of my head, no, but I do know that the statutory maximum sentences for robberies, burglaries, and a host of other offenses in addition to carjacking were also lowered. And I do know that the mandatory minimum sentences for virtually all offenses were eliminated, except for first-degree murder.
Before one objects to that lowering, wouldn't it be important to know whether or not it's lowered to a point that might disincentivize behavior, or lowered to a point that seems to be letting people off the hook for bad actions? Because it certainly seems to be the case that many people are responding to the revelation that the carjacking sentences are still 24 years, very much in line with other states, including conservative states, to say, well, what exactly is all the hubbub about? And I'd be curious to know, before people wring their hands and tear out their hair over the new robbery guidelines, what they in fact actually are. That would seem to be, to me, a first step before leveraging or lobbying complaints.
Yeah, I mean, well, again, I think that would that would also apply in the other direction. But it's not just the carjacking issue. And I think when you're talking about
Well, we're talking about the
lowering
robbery issue
the
right
statutory,
now. Or
right,
we
we're
would be,
talking
except
robbery, we're
that there's
talking
a
burglary, we're
deficit of
talking
detail
other
here.
offenses. Right, and we're talking all other offenses other than first-degree murder that have statutory minimums, mandatory minimums that are now going to be eliminated. Right,
And a number of other charges that have been, the penalties have been increased because there were basically no penalties at all. So it's a real mixed bag here, which again begs the question why the President of the United States chose to step in and undermine the democratic decision-making of a locality that, frankly, for exactly this reason, has been advocating for statehood and self-determination. But we appreciate you coming in today to talk to us, Rafael.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.